There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads, the penultimate Friday Reads of the year, I believe. Let me look at the calendar. Have I got that right? I think so. Yes, indeed, there's only one more Friday this year. I don't have a lot to say book-wise. I have some substantive content, but not a great deal of it. Does that make sense? Anyway, we'll get there eventually, Sean. So I wanted to check in uncharacteristically about stuff I've been watching on Netflix. I don't have Netflix because I don't watch enough TV to justify paying a subscription, but I avail myself of Mom's Netflix and we watch stuff together. So I guess I'll start back with the somewhat new, it's not that new anymore, the Rob Lowe and his son. They have a sitcom called Unstable or something. Unstable, yeah. And John Owen Lowe. They're really good in it, but it's terrible. It's a really bad show. It's not good. So after about 4 episodes, Mom and I thought it's just too silly, even though they're really good in it. So we stopped watching that. So then I suggested to Mom that we give Heartstopper a try. And I was completely indifferent to the comic book series that came out in the past 5 years, or I don't know how long ago. I don't respond well to romantic stories in text form. I just, the example I always use is Call Me By Your Name, or whatever that stupid, sickly, sweet novel was. That Andre Aciman, was that his name? Hated it so much, passionately hated it, couldn't finish it, but I quite liked the movie with Timothée Chalamet. So I'm happy to report that trend continues, because I didn't ever try the graphic series of Heartstopper, but Mom and I started watching the TV show, all 3 seasons. There is only 3 seasons, and all 3 of them are on Netflix, and we just fell into it, especially me, I have to say. I'm loving it so much, and it's not stopping my heart, but it's ripping my heart out. It's taking me back to my high school days. And, you know, I'm probably the last person on earth who wasn't familiar with the story, but so I don't really need to explain it to y'all, but it's a high school romance between 2 16-year-old boys, or 17-year-old boys. And there was none of that possibility for me at that age. I certainly had all those budding hormonal emotional feelings for other boys, but, you know, small town Saskatchewan in the mid-'80s, there wasn't a lot of space for queer love, let me tell you. It's so well done. The acting is just phenomenal. Even like all the side characters are as richly drawn, acted, have as much nuance as the 2 leads. I just love it so much, but it breaks my heart almost every episode. It's just like I feel like it's yanking my heart out. So I've been watching that with Mom, and I think we're going to binge watch it. We're just started season 2, and I bet you before New Year's Day we'll have the whole 3 seasons done, because I just love it. And the other one that I really wanted to watch with her on Netflix is a documentary, Will and Harper. And again, probably you all know about it, so I won't spend too much time explaining it, but it is Will Ferrell, and I have always disliked him just because I think he's kind of weird, and I don't think in my life I've ever watched him in a movie because he was in the movie. I didn't watch it because he was in it. And I mean, I had no basis. He's just kind of hit me the wrong way. His shtick on Saturday Night Live or whatever, I've never liked him. Isn't he in the Elf? And it's just like, if any of the previews of any of his movies, I just think, ooh, gross. And now he has made this documentary with one of his best friends who came out as a trans woman. Harper. So Will and Harper, and they take a road trip across America, very, you know, like last year or something. It's very, very contemporary, because his friend Harper felt unsafe and uncertain about going out to the places that she used to go in her previous life. And it is really heartwarming. Now, I don't know if I'm still not sure if I ever want to watch any of Will Ferrell's movies, but I love him. I have so much respect for him. And Harper is even more of a hero. It's so incredible. So I recommend that very personally and heartfully. And I've needed this kind of emotional content. And as the year comes to a close, I've had quite a up and down year, and this kind of programming is really speaking to me. So there is a couple recommendations. You probably won't hear me talk about TV or movies. Oh, although I'm really looking forward to the Bob Dylan movie with Timothée Chalamet. Apparently it's Oscar worthy, and I'm a big Timothy fan. So it opens on Christmas Day, and Mum and I are going to go over the holidays, I think. So without further ado, oh my God, do I have a mystery guest for you this week? And this week's mystery guest is one of my very favorite writers, and boy, am I ever lucky to have him join us. This is Stephen Markley. He is the author of two novels. The first one is from 2018, Ohio, which I absolutely loved. His 2022 novel, The Deluge, which I just recently finished and is my book of the year and very well tabbed to boot. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
This is just awesome. Thank you for being generous with your time. If you don't mind, just give us a minute introduction to what this novel, The Deluge, is all about.
I just call it a near future epic of the climate crisis. So it's about what prospectively we will be living through as the crisis continues. And, it's a sort of a fictional rendering of that.
I believe that you started this several years ago before you even started working on Ohio. Is that right?
I started them at roughly the same time in 2010. So that was a big year when sort of I began both of these book projects that would consume a decade plus of my life.
I can see why. I don't want to spend too much time on genre. Near future epic, I think, is the best one. But what do you think about terms like cli-fi or dystopia?
Well, I don't love dystopia. I feel like dystopia is sort of a way of like whistling through the graveyard of what we're actually living through. And I think my novel is a pretty accurate representation of what we are and what we will live through. In fact, I think it's beginning to look like the Rosie scenario, if that's if that's something you can stomach. But yeah, otherwise I tend not to care too much about labels. I'm just a writer grappling with different topics. I try to leave the branding to others.
There are, I would say, maybe 6 or 7 key characters, and I think a total of maybe 100 characters in this novel. And the only way that I could keep track of them was to make an alphabetical character list and give paid references. So if I couldn't remember who this character was, I could go back to my little list and follow them. But I've chosen maybe 3 of my favorite key characters that I'd love for you to introduce us to, because this is very much a character-driven novel as much as it is about the political and environmental stuff. So maybe let's start with Ash, who was my favorite, I have to say.
Thank you. Ash he's a mathematician, neurodivergent. He's got a very particular point of view, about just about everything. And most of his chapters in the novel are sort of told through his thinking out loud as he writes various white papers that he shares with policymakers and whatnot.
And yet he is maybe the character who, at least this particular reader, gets the most emotionally invested in. Like, he's kind of a Spock character in some ways, but yet that's a very deceptive, superficial reading of his character. You bring out so much emotion in him that will stick with me forever. How about Jackie?
Jackie is a PR flack. She works in public relations and advertising, and then ends up on an account for the fossil fuel majors as they attempt to delay action on the climate crisis in the world of the novel.
And all of these characters, I think, go through a lot of changes, and they just kind of jump around in their lives and in their beliefs. And Jackie, I would say in particular.
Yeah, Jackie has a big turn later in the book. But the novel sort of takes each character over the course of their lives. It's sort of a full accounting of who they are and where they end up, right? So with Jackie, we meet her as just sort of a young woman trying to work her way up the corporate ladder. And she sort of represents what I think, a lot of people who go to work in the world these days feel, which is, we're just trying to get ahead, just trying to make a name for ourselves, get some financial security, maybe be recognized for our skills, our talent. And as her story moves forward, she begins to wrestle with the ethical and moral implications of what she's doing.
Yeah, Jackie was just absolutely fascinating. And the interactions between the characters, of course, and we're not going to get into anything spoilery, but the last one that we can't not talk about is Kate.
Yeah. Yeah, so Kate is kind of the beating heart of the novel. She's the character around which, everything is in constellation. She begins as a young climate activist who's intent on changing the situation. And as the novel progresses and her efforts are stymied, she continues to improvise, sort of use her imagination in order to spark greater and greater pieces of this social movement to make change.
And what a fascinatingly sexual being.
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely, as are many of the characters. And I knew from Ohio that you integrate sex and sexuality into your characters, unlike very many other writers I've read. So,
well, thank you.
I don't know how to say this or make it into a question, but there was something that struck me about the way in which you show these characters, and like I say, there's dozens more, wrestling with the social, political, environmental stuff in the context of their rich and screwed up and highly sexualized or whatever personal lives. And you don't write anybody off. And almost everybody, there's some kind of a moral or a psychological journey that they go on. And in fact, some of them just kind of end up in the opposite place morally or politically from where they started. There's a lot of heady environmental political science stuff, but it's so incredibly grounded in the richest, most nuanced character work. Maybe the question is, how do you do that?
If I knew, I would bottle and sell it. No, I mean, my theory is always that when writing about these big issues, we can refer to any number of hundreds and hundreds of books about these subjects in the nonfiction space. But what really makes us like connect to an idea is character and is sort of the emotional realism of what's happening all around us. And I just thought that and continue to think that character is always the entry into these heavier topics. And that's why, with something as enormous as the climate crisis, I wanted to look at it through the eyes of all these different characters from all these different perspectives. In a novel where no one really agrees with each other on anything, including the people who think we should do something about it, they don't necessarily agree on what we should do about it, right? So it was sort of my way of grappling with this enormous issue and exploring it from all these different dimensions.
And then it's the sheer, I mean, it's a 900-page novel. And it could have been longer, actually. I wish it was twice this length. I mean, I didn't want it to end. And I have a story.
That's my favorite compliment is when people, people who don't pick it up, they're like, it looks long. And then anybody who finish it is like, I wish it was twice as long. So.
Oh, absolutely. But the sheer scale of the story that you're telling with the science and the politics it starts in about, I think, 2013, goes to about 2040. How did you keep track of that or envision that? It's such a mammoth epic story. How did you keep yourself kind of organized?
Yeah, I mean, I keep a running document beside the text that is just sort of here's important dates, here's how old this character is, here's what they're doing then or now. But I also think for me as an intellectual project, and Ohio was the same way, keeping these incredibly complicated timelines in my head is sort of the fun of it. It's sort of the challenge of being able to know the world so well it feels like your own life, so you can remember those events and how they happened in all their sort of the distinct pockets. And yeah, I don't know, it's just sort of the way I like to approach writing is multiple characters, multiple timelines, multiple perspectives, and then hopefully if you do it right, the reader gets this incredible pleasure, this psychological pleasure from sort of putting the puzzle together themselves. Right? You're giving them all the clues. And as it starts to click into place, it's just this this genuine feeling of oh, I understand now how this all interlocks. And I always find that to be a really enjoyable sort of technique in literature.
This is something that you talked about on the Seth Meyers interview and probably elsewhere, but I'm going to ask you to trot it out again because it's so incredible. As you were writing the book, the weather events kind of were overtaking what you were writing. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's still happening. I would write this terrifying situation into the novel, and then something would happen in the real world And that situation would be, oh, that's not that terrifying anymore because it just happened. And so I even to the last second, I was editing and revising to update the text with increasingly scary weather events, political events. Just this past week, I've had multiple emails and texts about this healthcare CEO in America who is shot by this guy. And people just saying this feels like it was ripped from your book, right? And I always say that none of this is any clairvoyance on my part. It's simply that I read a novel about the trends of what we're living through, the climate crisis, rising inequality that is just like wildly out of control, increasing authoritarianism in our politics. Like all of these things have been to me pretty evident going back over a decade, right? And now that they're all sort of like blooming, the book has that feeling of clairvoyance, but it's just looking at the trends that scientists have been telling us for 40, 50 years since before I was born.
I read this as a buddy read with a bookish friend who lives in the state of Maine. And we both felt like once we got into it, which maybe 100 pages in, we started interpreting the weather news that was happening concurrently through your book. I think that I'm going to be using this novel as a touchstone for the rest of my life about at least this hasn't come true yet, or that, yeah, Stephen said that was going to happen, or something like that happened. The reason I don't like the word dystopia for this novel is that I felt, and we're not going to get into spoilers, but it felt hopeful at the end. Yeah. What can you say? What do you want to say that isn't a spoiler about that? I mean, I felt a similar sense in Ohio.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a dystopia, and I think anybody who reads the novel with any, in any kind of close way is going to see that it is a roadmap for how we get out of this, right? Like I spent an enormous amount of time thinking through, like, okay, we have every policy we need, we have every technology we need to begin rapidly decarbonizing the global economy. So why isn't it happening faster? And the answer to that is political, social, rather than technological or economic. It's about our will as citizens. And, the book makes the case that we can still do this. And at the end, it sort of explores how we might go about that. And it will remain a roadmap far into the future of how we turn this situation around.
This is a very American novel. I'm Canadian and I didn't have a problem with how American it was, but I couldn't help think of Churchill's quote. I'm trying to look it up, but everybody knows the quote. Americans will always do the right thing, but only after they've tried absolutely everything else. And that's kind of could have been an epigraph for the novel. Americans do not have a monopoly on that particular truth. Hey, this is Editing Shawn here. Something happened at this point in the interview where I didn't phrase it. I very inartfully posed a question. And so I've edited out all that confusing part. But what I'm left with is a quantum leap into a new topic. So, and I didn't want to edit out that part because it's fascinating. So I'm just going to say that now we're going to move on to talk about why read serious, potentially depressing literature, while keeping the idea that this is actually ultimately a hopeful novel, but there are a lot of there's a lot of doom and gloom in it as well. So I needed to put this in here so that the next part really makes sense, and you don't get to see how badly I asked the question and editing all that nonsense out.
I try to contain my annoyance at times, but just that people don't want to be challenged by a novel at all anymore is sometimes occasionally irritating. Like I thought that's what literature was for. I just feel like what is literature for but to challenge us, but to make us think about the world we're living in. And when people, sort of say, "Oh, it's a tough read, it's a slog, it's it's this or that, or it's scary, it's frightening," it's like, good, good. It's what I set out to do. And if it hurts book sales, so be it, right? The novel should give the reader the full weight of what's happening, while at the same time not just like pointing them towards doom. Like it should also serve as an idea for how we get out of this. So that's my theory of
Sure, and just to circle back to the character work in this novel. I mean that the way things turn around is through good people doing good things, And that's overly simplistic. I realize there's all kinds of social, political, and forces, but it's only good people working together, however muddlingly, if that's an adverb, that's going to turn it around. My buddy reader Heidi in Maine and we took a week off because we were both so absorbed in the election the week before, the week that the election was on. And then after that dreadful result, we compared notes, and we both really didn't want to pick it up again. We said, "Oh, I'm so depressed already. I don't know if," and we both had the same experience. That once we got a couple pages in, by that point we were in the final, 100 pages. It was actually a bomb. Challenging, but a bomb. Good for our souls. Any thoughts on where all this is now in the Trump 2 era?
I don't think I'm gonna break any news on your podcast that I was a Harris voter. Look, I am as disappointed and anxious about what's coming as anybody else. Like I'm in that camp. Like none of this is good. None of it can be sugarcoated. We're in a really, really tough situation. But also, there is no time to despair. Like the climate crisis is going to outlast Donald Trump by generations, right? And it's going to outlast this moment by generations. So the question is, what do we do while at the federal level in the United States, one of the most important economies when it comes to solving the climate crisis, when that federal power is unavailable to us, what do the rest of us do? But I think there is good news, right? Which is that it didn't help him in even getting his party's nomination, but Joe Biden passed this bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, which has jump-started a clean energy revolution in the United States. It's going to be incredibly difficult for Trump and the Republicans to tear all that down, even though they'll try. There's a lot of steel in the ground already. A lot of the money's already out the door. The cheapest way to produce energy on the planet right now is by pointing a piece of glass at the sun. That economic momentum is not just happening in North America. It's happening on steroids in China right now. China's almost already won the race to the clean energy revolution. So anybody who wants to be economically competitive in the 21st century is going to have to find a way to compete on a zero carbon playing field. Now, this is all going to have to move much, much faster. And so people who care about this are going to have to look for the opportunities to accelerate that. In the States, we have this wonderful thing, occasionally terrible thing called federalism, where individual states can, push action farther. And certainly in California, our governor and the political apparatus here is still committed to the Paris targets, right? And so, look, we all are these little political agents at all times. So the choices we make in the next 4 years, while at the federal level action is stalled, are going to be important. I'll just leave you with this. I took my moment of despair in the days after the election, and then I sort of sat down and told myself, like, you can cry later, like it's back to work.
Absolutely. Got to keep on going. Stephen, what are you working on now?
So I am writing on a TV show in Hollywood, California called Paradise, which comes out in January, late January. You might be able to recognize a few of the themes from some of my novels in it, maybe not. It's a big piece of populist entertainment. I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, wow. So it's an original series.
Yes, yes. And
it's not the Toni Morrison novel.
No, it is not. It's definitely not.
Oh, wow.
I'm also working on a book of short stories. One of those stories will actually be available in an issue of Playboy magazine coming out in January, and the collection will probably be 2026.
And sorry, what was the name of that magazine?
Playboy.
Oh, Playboy. Yes, I've heard of it.
Yeah, you've heard of it.
Not my thing, but oh, wow. I didn't even know Playboy was still publishing.
Well, they're popping back up. I think just to publish my story.
That's amazing. Oh, wow. The short stories. I can't picture a Stephen Markley short story, which makes me all the more excited.
Well, I had to spend a lot of time editing this one too. So I like editing things down is always the battle I'm waging. And then looking farther down the road, I will be writing another novel after the story collection.
That's awesome. I can't wait. Please tell us what you've been reading recently that you'd like to recommend.
I had this book on my shelf for a few years, and finally I was just like, all right, it's been sitting there staring at me. So I read Richard Yates' Revolutionary Road, and I just can't recommend that book enough. It still feels so contemporary, so modern. It is dark and beautiful, and just like one of those novels where you're like, oh yeah, when somebody really nails this, it is the best feeling. It is the best way of looking at our own humanity.
And it's kind of a punch to the heart that you end up feeling grateful for.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Anything else?
If you're feeling abject despair about the climate crisis, I do recommend a book by Thich Nhat Hanh called Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet, which to me is a really compelling case for why, even though we must move quickly and action is urgent, it's still finding the sort of space within ourselves to keep going and to, perhaps the modes of vomiting out our feelings on surveillance capitalist platforms is not doing us any favors. And sort of reconnecting with people and thinking about our relationships to each other is a much more fruitful path.
And I think a good place to start for people that's never considered that is reading one of your novels, because that's absolutely what you get out of it, or one of the many things. Stephen, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely inspiring chat.
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh my God. I couldn't believe Stephen Markley said yes. I sent him an imploring little message through his website saying, I just finished reading your book, and I know you've done 1,000 interviews about it, but would you consider coming on my little show? And he wrote back and did it. So kudos to him. I was obviously, I don't need to point this out to you, you just watched the chat. I was quite starstruck, and I'm feeling a little embarrassed about that, but it was a great chat, and very deeply appreciative to Stephen Markley for making time for me and my little old booktube channel in the corner of the YouTube universe. So, wow. So that is in lieu of me doing a full review, because it's now too much time has passed. I won't be doing a full review of The Deluge, but it is my book of the year. It takes me about a week to do the editing for a big long video like the one I put up this week. So I have one video to tell you about that I posted, I think, the night before last. And this is one of the collaborative ideas that I came up with that I'm kind of proudest of, because it was an unusual project. And it's, probably not going to garner 1 million hits, although eventually it will. But I noticed that 2 queer novels that I read this year, or one of them I finished this year, started the year before, had the same 2-line epigraph from The Little Prince. The Family Way by Christopher Dorado and Birding by Rose Ruane. And when I realized the coincidence of that, I contacted them both. I pointed out the coincidence to both of them separately and said, would you be interested in reading each other's novels and then coming together for a Zoom chat with me about your novels and about what this epigraph means to you and how it resonates with the 2 narratives? And they very enthusiastically said yes, and so several months later we had the chat, and that's what's went up this week. So it's an interesting conversation about epigraphs and what do they mean, why do writers use them, and various things I'd never thought about regarding epigraphs come up in the discussion, and then kind of a back and forth, a 3-way discussion about those 2 fabulous novels, The Family Way and Birding. So in the fullness of time, I do urge you to check it out. It was one of the bigger projects I took on in 2024 on my channel, and it's now published. So, I finished 1 book. I hoped to finish 2, but story of my life, I didn't quite get the second one finished. But I did finish this. This was a buddy read with my local Saskatoon friend, Gwen. Last year's Booker winner, Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. And it's funny. Stephen Markley's The Deluge, my book of the year, was a very heavy topic with a lot of tragedy and strife and violence and suffering. But it didn't stress me out. It was mostly almost completely a positive reading experience. Page turner. I was deeply invested in the characters, and I didn't suffer while reading it. And this was the complete opposite. This was also it's a marvelous masterpiece of a novel, and it almost killed me to read it. And I'm still thinking about why it hit me differently than The Deluge. I think it actually was just the week in which I finished reading it, because I started this novel, Gwen and I both started this novel 8 months ago, and then things came up in both our lives and we put it on hold. And then we've both went back to it in the last couple of weeks and finished it up. And we had a lovely chat over sushi yesterday about it. And It resonated with what's going on in the world this week in particular. So I'm thinking about things like the American Congress recommending an investigation against Lynn Cheney and all the other fucked up Nazi shit that is already starting to poke its head up in the lead up to Trump taking over the reins. He's acting like he is the president, and people are reacting to him as if he is the president. And there's a lot of really disturbing stuff that's been happening. And the way that that's destabilizing governments around the world. Germany, the government fell. Canada, I'm not gonna. It has been just a shit show this week. Trudeau's probably gone from public life any day now. But it's all because of the chaos of Trump and the ominous undertow of the power that, thinking to Timothy Snyder, who says, don't give up your power to an authoritarian in advance. And it feels like some of that is already happening. So reading this book, which is about Ireland descending into a dictatorship, centered on one family, I almost couldn't read it. It was causing me such anxiety. And I'm really glad that I kept through to the end. It's so beautifully written and it's so powerfully told. But it really fucked me up. So if you're as disturbed by what's going on in the world, it's not like I don't want to suggest that you shouldn't read it, but I'm just being honest with how it affected me. It almost killed me. I guess there wasn't as much hope in this. A couple more comments about it. I'm going to put it down now. I watched an interview between Paul Lynch and Colm Toibin right around the time that this book was published. It was some kind of an Irish book club thing that Colm Toibin has been doing for a year. Fabulous conversation. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And one of the things that I really took away from that chat was Paul Lynch saying that he wanted to take the Iliad and turn it inside out. And so this is a epic novel about powerlessness. Powerlessness in the face of autocracy. Focused on this one kind of middle-class family in Dublin. And through the perspective of the mother. First her husband disappears, and then a whole bunch of other calamities befall her family that I'm not going to mention. You'll have to read the book. And it is the inability to make a good decision about how to do. So one of the decisions is she's urged by several important people in her life to leave. Get the hell out of Ireland before it gets worse. And she resists, and she's got personal reasons, especially to do with the disappearance of her husband. Her husband disappears in the first 10 pages, so that's not a spoiler. When I say disappeared, he's taken into custody with no due process and no way of her finding out where he is or what's going on. But that's what keeps her there. There was something so traumatizing for me this particular week, seeing how things can so easily, Trump's talking about Canada becoming part of the United States, the 51st state. He's been taunting Trudeau, calling him the governor of the great state of Canada. Now, I mean, he's just being a jerk. Well, there you go. Is he? What would happen if on February 1st of next year he sends the troops? Who would stop him? I'm not losing sleep over that particular scenario, but I just think things could get really scary very suddenly. And so reading this book about that actually happening, and when I say actually, I'm talking about a work of literature, it was beyond unsettling. And I loved it. It's such a good novel. It absolutely deserved to win the Booker. But it's one of those fuck me up novels that I'm glad I put myself through it, but it was a putting through type of reading experience. And that is basically all I have to say today, because I haven't finished anything or started anything new to tell you about, and I'm not going to be starting anything new. I've got a week and a half, 11 days of reading this year, and in fact, if I give myself until the first Friday reads of 2025, then I've got 2 weeks of reading, and I will give myself those 2 weeks to finish up as many of my current reads so that going forward I can bring some of my bookish New Year's resolutions into force, into being. But I'm probably not going to get there quite by then, but I'm going to do my best without overdoing it or rushing through books. That's not my style. So on that happy note, oh, thanks for watching.